name is Eileen Sheehan, and my poem, My Father, Long Dead, is on the Leaving Cert curriculum 2020. So I'll just read the poem for you and talk for a few minutes about it afterwards. My father, long dead. My father, long dead, has become air, become scent of pipe smoke, of turf smoke, of resin, become light and shade on the river, become foxglove, buttercup, tree bark, become corncrake, lost from the meadow, become silence, places of calm, become badger at dusk, deer in the thicket, become grass on the road to the castle, become mist on the turret, become dark-haired hero in the story written by a dark-haired child. When I start writing poems or I get the idea for a poem, I always write in longhand, usually on an A4 pad. So when this poem was first written, it was about 3 times longer than the poem you see now in the book. I noticed early on that I had the refrain become in quite a few places throughout the first draft. So I decided to keep that. I liked the resonance of it, the sound of it. Mostly I liked the idea that it evoked for me how a relationship can change and evolve over time, even though the person has passed away. My next job then, I decided I stripped away all the narrative elements in the poem and thought I would leave the imagery tell the story. So every image I kept evokes the landscape where I grew up in rural Kerry, as well as having a very personal resonance for me and my relationship with my dad. So if you take, for example, the line, become corncrake, lost from the meadow. I have a particular memory of standing at the meadow gate one evening with my dad and hearing this really weird sound, quite a metallic, creaking sound. And it would be Dad that told me that that was the call of the corncrake. I think I fell in love with the word almost immediately because it was an onomatopoeic word where the name of the bird echoes the actual awful sound it makes. This really creaking sound, which is very unmelodic actually, and doesn't at all sound like a bird song. And of course now corncrakes have become an endangered species, even though they were quite common when I was a child. The next word, I suppose, that I gave quite a lot of thought to was the word shade, from the line, become light and shade on the river. Shade means shadow, as in light and shadow, but it has an extra resonance for me personally because it also means ghost or spirit, and my dad worked on the river. So I like the idea for me that almost his spirit still existed on the river in the place he had worked. Working through the poem then, where do you end it? So the ending evolved quite naturally because my dad would have told me stories of folklore and would have told me fairy tales. So the line where the castle becomes introduced, to me that's where the mythology enters the poem. So the castle in that case it's more a mythological castle, the archetypal castle from fairy tale and folklore, rather than any real castle that existed in the landscape where I grew up. From looking at me, you could probably tell that hair could evolve to be an important motif in my poems. What you can tell from reading the poem is that my mother was a redhead and my father was quite dark-haired, and often it would be, I suppose, like a family joke, whereas if we got into a temper or a little sulk, we'd be told that, that was from the red-haired side of the family. The old cliche associated with redheads. Whereas my father's side, I always associated with the stories. So it was very important for me personally in this poem, I suppose, to align myself with the paternal line and finish the poem on that unity with my father. It also has an extra resonance in folklore, and particularly going back to the bardic schools, where it wasn't the preserve of women to write poems. There was a particular story in folklore from my locality about a bardic poet who lived on the New Line in Castleisland. It was common then that the poets would gather, usually in public houses, and they would have almost like a competition. They would have a spontaneous uttering of poems which they would make up on the spot following all their years of training in the bardic school. One such poet was in a public house in Castleisland one day, and he made his public utterance, and to his great dismay the poem was answered or echoed by his daughter. He was shocked at this, and in fact he was quite enraged at it, because in folklore women weren't allowed to be poets. They were really only seen as the subject of poems, not as the authors of poems. And in fact he left the pub in a great rage and put a curse on her before he left, because in folklore it said that if poetry broke out in a female of the line, that poetry would vanish from that line for 7 generations. So it's very important to me as a woman to claim that heritage, because I believe that we all have that right and responsibility, and we all are custodians of the stories of our heritage and our family line.